Good morning, everyone. I'm Sonal Patel, Senior Editor at Power Magazine, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the inaugural Data Center Power Exchange. For 143 years, Power has covered the infrastructure that powers modern life, from policy and regulatory battles and to technology transformations and market restructuring. But what is unfolding over the last few years is categorically different. For decades after decades of growth, we started to document demand forecasts that weren't just rising, they were doubling. And by early 2024, that trend had crystallized into an industry-wide reckoning. And at the same time, in the power industry, we were seeing power system straining, transmission delays for stretching out for more than a decade, 4-year wait times for transformers and turbines, gas pipeline capacity falling short, and everywhere was the same fundamental question. Who pays for the infrastructure? How do we maintain reliability? What happens to ratepayers? And how do we secure community acceptance? So here's what became clear. Utilities and hyperscalers and regulators and financiers were each trying to solve the same problem, how to power the digital future without breaking the grid. But doing so in isolation from opposite sides of the table. And that's what DPX was built to change. We've been working with our excellent advisory board. We designed a summit around a simple premise to bring together the leaders and structure the conversation around the projects that they actually build. Today's agenda follows a life cycle framework from site selection. We're going to talk about the components and the fuel shortages and the line gaps and address location questions. We're going to talk about development, where permitting and financing determine project viability. We're going to talk about operations, where AI is transforming the grid and where it has potential to optimize our operations. And finally, to forward planning, where regulators and operators prepare for crisis, just in case the power does not show up. The goal isn't more conversation today. It is really about coordination. Each session will address a real bottleneck, and each speaker brings domain authority. I want to thank our advisory board and every one of our speakers, and who come from the federal and state regulatory space and utility executives. We have hyperscale executives here, we have developers, we have engineers and operators. Everyone who has stepped forward to make this dialogue, I'm truly grateful to you. I also want to thank our phenomenal DPX team, whose work over the past few months has made this vision come to life. And now, to open the day and ground us in the scale of the challenge ahead, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Mark Christie, former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Chairman Christie has spent his career at the intersection of reliability, regulation, and market design, and he has served nearly 17 years on the Virginia State Corporation Commission, led both the organization of PJM states and Mid-Atlantic Conference regulatory commissioners, and he has taught regulatory constitutional law for more than 2 decades. And he's also served as an officer in the Marine Corps. So please welcome Chairman Christie.
Well, thank you, Sonal, and I also want to echo her comments about the team that put this proceeding together, DPX 25. Welcome to DPX 25. I think this is the kickoff, and it's been extremely well organized. I've been really impressed working with Sonal and her team. Thanks to you all for coming out early in the morning. It's not early if you're on the East Coast, those of us on Eastern time, but if you're from California, this is really early. So thank you for coming out. The topic of my speech today is really comes down to a phrase that President Franklin Roosevelt used at the depth of the Depression in the 1930s with war clouds gathering in Europe. And President Roosevelt said, America is facing a rendezvous with destiny. And I would paraphrase that by saying today, when it comes to the electric grid, I think America is facing a rendezvous with reality. So what is the reality that we're going to have a rendezvous with, whether we like it or not? Because the thing about reality is you can run from reality for a while, but reality will track you down. And reality is tracking us down, and in two main areas. First, in terms of the reliability of the electric grid. You know, Americans expect, when Americans talk about reliability, what they mean is, I want power 24/7, 365. That's what Americans expect. You know, there are parts of the world, I've been to those parts of the world where sometimes the power's on the afternoon, maybe the power's on the afternoon 3 days a week, and people just accept that. Well, Americans don't accept that. Americans want power 24/7, 365. So we're facing a crisis in reliability. We're also facing another crisis, and that crisis is in rising customer power bills. EIA just came out yesterday and said that year-over-year prices increases in power bills for consumers was 6% over the last year. That's way over the rate of inflation. And if you look at the last 5 years, we've had more increases in power bills over the last 5 years than the previous 25. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it. But here's the point I want to make about the reality that's being faced. In 1848, Alexis de Tocqueville, after writing Democracy in America, he was then a parliamentarian in France. And he told his fellow members of the French Parliament in 1848, on the eve of the 1848 revolution, he said, "We are all sleeping on a volcano. I think rising power prices are a political volcano that's on the verge of exploding." So we have to keep in mind consumer costs, which really is, I think, a volcano about to explode. So what's happening on reliability? It really comes down to sort of a simple Econ 101. Econ 101, what do you look at? You look at supply and demand. On the supply side, over the last several years in America, we've been retiring prematurely too many dispatchable generating units, particularly coal. Now, I know some people don't like the word coal, but the reality is we have not been replacing coal with equivalent dispatchable generation. We simply have not been doing that. Certainly in RTOs like PJM, which depend upon the capacity market and energy markets to finance new generation. So on the supply side, we haven't been building enough new dispatchable generation. We've been retiring too much, prematurely retiring. So the supply side has been going in a wrong direction. At the same time, on the demand side, and many of you all today are very interested in this business, on the demand side, obviously we're all aware that the increase in load, largely driven by large load customers, hyperscale customers, has increased load forecasts, which in turn increases, for example, in PJM, the load forecasts become the demand curve, and the demand curve becomes the single biggest determinant of the prices in the PJM capacity market. And there's no coincidence that rising load forecasts equals rising prices in the PJM capacity market, which we've seen the last two times have hit all-time highs. So this is the two crises we face. We face a reliability problem from failure to build and replace sufficient generation. And on the consumer cost side, we're facing what I think is going to be a political volcano if it isn't resolved, and that is the increases in consumer costs. Now, let me be clear about the load increases, because a lot of you guys are in the data center business, and I understand that. When I speak to audiences and I make these comments about data centers, and in Virginia, data centers have become a very big political issue. One thing I say is, how many of you are carrying one of these? And everybody, of course, is carrying one of these. I say, how many of you are carrying two of these? One business, one personal. And a lot of people are carrying two of these. I say, well, if you're carrying these, you're building data centers. So let's stop thinking that data centers came from Mars. Data centers enable us to live life online, which is what we do. We bank online, medical care online, sports betting online. That's key to a lot of people. So we live life online. So data centers are a fact of life. We need to serve that load. I'm a firm believer in the utility principle going back 125 years that all load must be served. Question, of course, is how do you serve it and how do you pay for it? So we need a ton of new generation. There's really no way around the reality that we're going to have to build a huge amount of new generation in America. And that really leads to three key questions. First question, how are we going to finance that new generation? Is it going to be rate-based mechanism? Is it going to be capacity markets? Is it going to be energy-only markets? CEG Texas? How are we going to finance all this new generation? And what is the best way to finance it? Second question it leads to, what is the role of states? After all, people on the 5 years I was on FERC, people would frequently say, well, what's FERC going to do to build generation? Why doesn't FERC just order more generation? Well, guess what? FERC doesn't order generation to be built. FERC doesn't permit generation with one small exception, and that's hydro. But FERC doesn't order generation to be built. Other than that, FERC regulates the markets, and it has a big effect. But it's the states that issue CPCNs for generation. It's the states that approve the integrated resource plans, the IRPs, that in non-RTO states certainly drive what gets built. And third question is, what is the best regulatory framework at the state level to get generation built and to serve reliability? Is it the quote-unquote deregulated model that we see in states like Maine and PJM? Or is it a vertically integrated model where generation can be financed through rate basing, as we see in states like Georgia, Florida, in the non-RTO states? So those are all questions that need to be asked. And of course, when we're talking about building out the generation that has to be built, how are the costs going to be allocated? Cost allocation is always a key question in utility regulation. How do you allocate the cost? Who pays? That's something every regulator, certainly at the state level, because that's where most of it's taking place. How do you allocate those costs? And how are we going to deal with the impact on reliability as we increase the load, largely driven by hyperscale users, which again, I'm a firm believer you have to serve all load. But what's the impact on reliability? If we interconnect large load without generation available, there's a small problem of physics. Load increases without generation, something's got to give. Something's got to give. So we got to balance the increasing load with providing supply of generation to service it. So these are the challenges we really face, I think, is the reality that we're facing, and I would say it's a dual crisis. On the reliability side, we have to build a lot more generation to serve the load that's already here, the load forecasts that are already driving, example in the PJM capacity market, already driving prices up. So we have to serve load. We've got to build generation. And of course, if you're building new generation and you're serving new load, you obviously have the costs of network upgrades as well. So I've even talked about the wires cost, which is a substantial part of that. And we have to do all this. We have to meet this challenge to keep the lights on. We have to do this while making sure that customers can actually afford to pay that monthly power bill, and that electricity doesn't become a luxury item that only a few can afford. Because if that day happens, I think the political explosion on that is just going to be breathtaking in its consequences. So we can't let it get to that point. Electricity has to be seen as it is a basic necessity of life. There may have been a day 50 years ago, 75 years ago, before rural electrification, when people lived without electricity. Not today. People expect it. So those are the key, I think, challenges that we face today. And in both of those, I think reality has tracked us down. Reality has tracked us down, and we're going to have to deal with the reality of both the reliability challenge and the consumer cost challenge, because you can't keep putting off reality. It will track you down, and it has. And with that, I'm now, okay. I'm going to move on, though, because those are the two main points I want to make. I'm going to move on and ask, we have two special guests today, and I'm going to ask the first one to come up. This person's uniquely suited to talk about these challenges, because Bob Blue is the chairman and CEO of Dominion Energy, Virginia, which, if you just arrived in America, Dominion is the utility for what I would call ground zero of the data center revolution. Not just ground zero in America, but I would say ground zero for the planet. There's more data center activity in Dominion Zone in PJM than anywhere else, I would say, in the world. So I'm going to ask Bob Blue, Chairman and CEO of Dominion, to come up and give a few remarks. And thank you all for your attention. And after that, we'll have some questions and continue the discussion. But thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.